Bruce, welcome. Thank you very much for your time. We're here to talk about traps, looking at traps for rats, mice, cats, and of course possums. We're looking more at a practical use for people around the home, the farm, reserves, not large scale use. You're an expert on traps. How did you get into it?
I started exactly about 30 years ago, in 1979. A chap in the North Island called Les Broadmoor thought he developed the perfect trap, and he took it to the SPCA, and the SPCA was opposed to the continuing use of gin traps, and I've got some here and I can show you here. So this is the typical gin trap that people have used since the 1920s when the fur trade first started in New Zealand, but a lot of people continue to really dislike these traps. But Les Broadmoor developed this kill trap. So we took it to the SPCA, and the SPCA thought, now we've got a humane replacement for the old gin trap. And they then took their case to the Minister of Forestry at the time, and the Minister of Forestry said, well, not sure whether we should ban the gin trap because we don't really know how efficient this is or whether it actually kills things quickly. So the Minister then came to the Forest Service at that stage, which I worked for then, and they asked me, because I had an interest in traps just from my boyhood and making pocket money from their fur, would I be interested in testing these traps? So the very first trials were to compare this trap with the gin trap in terms of its capture efficiency and looking to see how well this trap actually killed animals. And as it turned out, this trap actually had a very low capture efficiency and didn't kill particularly well. So up until this year, and I can talk about that later on, this trap has remained in use right up until 2009, so 30 years that it's still been in use.
Why was this one inefficient?
It requires the animal, when it's set, it requires the animal to put its head in there, so they have to actively want to do that, and you just get a lower capture rate because of that. Where a leg hold trap is a passive trap, animals can accidentally get caught in there. But also the diameter of that is quite small, so some animals were resistant in getting in there. And in terms of welfare, the spring is just not powerful enough, so it didn't kill the animals quickly. So consequently, that's not even on the market today. It just sort of disappeared, and after 1 or 2 years, nobody used it. But what happened with that testing? It told us something about what these traps should do in terms of being able to kill an animal, and that led to the development of international standards. And at the same time, the Canadians were getting into trap testing as well, because they had involvement in a huge international fur trade, which New Zealand was part of, but only a very, very small part of that. So the Canadians actually developed some national Canadian trap standards for humane traps. And then when they heard that New Zealand was involved in trap testing, they thought they could develop international standards, and they involved America and Argentina and Australia and some of the European countries. And over an 8-year period, they developed 2 ISO standards, one for kill traps and one for restraining traps that hold an animal alive. And those standards came out in 1999, and New Zealand has actually adopted those standards as NAWAC, National Animal Welfare Advisory Committee, which is a ministerial committee administered by MAF. They have a guideline for trap testing, and we now can test traps and see whether they perform and achieve the standards that are required in those guidelines. So we can test a trap and say that's not really acceptable in terms of its welfare performance, or it is. So people can now, I guess, be aware of how well traps perform in terms of their welfare performance before they buy a trap, which is all good for animal welfare. Because one of the issues, a lot of people, because we have a mentality in New Zealand that a lot of these animals are, because they're introduced, they're pests, and therefore it doesn't really matter if you hurt them or injure them or stress them, but they're still fully sentient animals, they're all mammals, and it's not their fault they were introduced. So although we have to kill them to control them, we should do it as welfare friendly or as humanely as we can. So most of the work that we've been involved in is trying to find out the best way of killing these pests.
Now we're going to look at possum traps in a wee while, but just be good to talk about the possum fur and skin industry in a wee bit. But firstly, if I trap a possum around my home or whatever, can I eat it? Is it safe to eat?
Generally speaking, yes, it will be safe to eat. I mean, we do have bovine TB in New Zealand, which affects our dairy and beef and venison herds. And the main wildlife vector of bovine TB is brush-tailed possums. But having said that, most possums that you would catch will not have bovine TB. Most areas where there is bovine TB are under heavy possum control. But clearly, if you captured a possum and there was a swollen lump on it, or there was pus coming out through the fur, you wouldn't eat that animal. But as long as it's cooked adequately, and really the TB bacteria can be killed, I think it's 60 or 80 degrees for 10 minutes, and you'll kill the bacteria anyway. So there's not a big risk from eating that animal for getting TB. Yeah.
Can I or anyone else make a living from trapping possums?
Well, I don't know about you, Tom, but people who can work hard can. Some people are currently making a living. I'm not sure just recently with the economic downturn, but certainly over the last five or so years, people have been making a reasonable living. But from plucking the fur, not from skinning them. So the fur industry, was the whole reason that possums were introduced into New Zealand, to start a fur trade. And that fur trade, the first fur was exported in about 1921, and the fur market peaked in 1981, and we exported 3.5 million skins, and that was worth about $23 million, I think it was. But more latterly, the focus has been on plucked fur, and it gets woven with merino, and it gets marketed by Snowy Peak, merino mink and perino, and there's a few different trade names. And just before Christmas, the market was paying about $105 a kilo of plucked fur, and depending on where you're trapping and the size of the animal you're getting, you probably need around about 15 to 20 possums per kilogram. So you're getting sort of $4, $5, $6 per possum for plucked fur. So to make a living, you've got to get quite a lot of possums per week. Yeah.
Now every day we hear people talking about the problem that pests are on our forests and all the rest of it, and there's long been an argument, let's get the unemployed people out there trapping. Yep. Is that something that's feasible?
The short answer is no. It does take a skill. You've got to be very fit and capable to work in sort of pretty steep topography and isolated environments. So it's not something that the unemployed can do. That doesn't mean some unemployed people could not do it, but most of them probably can't. And the other issue is that they don't have those skills, and it takes time, to build that skill up.
The other thing that a lot of people discuss is bring the bounty back, we'll get rid of the problem straight away. Yeah. Is that feasible?
And again, the short answer to that one is no as well, but people are still arguing that they should bring back the bounty. We did have a bounty for possums in the 1950s. They paid 2 shillings and 6pence for a possum, which is equivalent of about $14 today. And they ran it for 10 years, and I think they had 8 million tokens, and it had no impact on the numbers of possums or their spread. So the bounty was of no value at all back then. And the reason it fails is that it costs more to reduce numbers down low enough than the bounty will pay for. You need to get paid more than that. And the other reason is that it assumes that possums are equally pestiness, doesn't matter where they are. So you're paying for a bounty if someone picks a possum up off the road, they get paid the bounty. Where that area, the possum may not have been a pest. So it's better to spend your money where you need to do it, and that's what the DOC do and the Animal Health Board. They focus on where there is a critical problem, and they put their resources into that to get the possums down to the levels that are required. Yeah.
Okay, well, in a minute we'll look at some of these traps, but since we've got the gin trap here, we might as well talk about this, because you mentioned that they've been around for decades. They're now banned. Why is that?
Well, as I mentioned before, there's these ISO standards, and then there's the NAWAC, the National Animal Welfare Committee guidelines for testing traps. And the gin trap causes too many injuries. So there's a way of scoring. You get a wildlife pathologist that examines the limbs that are captured in the possums, and they score them. So you look for edema, swelling, lacerations, broken bones, and they get different scores. And the Lane's Ace trap, of all the leg hole traps that are available, causes the most injuries.
Now, just the name. The gin trap is
the Lane's Ace. Sorry, yeah. So gin traps are essentially metal-jawed traps. So this is commonly called the gin trap, but there are other traps that are metal-jawed gin trap, steel-jawed leg hole traps are typically gin traps really too. But this is the one that everybody acknowledges or recognises as the gin trap. This particular one is made by Lane's Industry in Australia, and it's called a Lane's Ace. And there's several different models of them, but these have basically not changed shape probably since the 1500s really. So they were banned in England in about 1956. But unfortunately they work, if you really wanted to catch the last possum somewhere and you wanted to pick the best trap for it, you'd probably, you'd want to use this one, because in terms of catcher efficiency it's the best. But it causes unacceptable level of injuries. Yeah.
And that's something that we're going to discuss as we look at the different traps.
Yep.
Animal welfare.
Yeah.
Right, so we've got a selection of traps here. We're going to start looking at some leg hold traps for possums.
Yep.
Can you explain the difference between a leg hold trap and one that will actually kill the animal?
Yep, okay. Well, if we start with leg hold traps, so these fit into the category of restraining trap, which includes box traps and cage traps, and because they're quite big, I haven't bought any of those today. So I've got some leg hold traps here, or foothold traps, some people call them. And those traps can be divided into two classes as well. So there's the gin trap that I showed you before. Now that's called a long spring trap for obvious reasons. It's got a very long spring. And an American, so that was made in Australia, an American version of that is a little number 1 Victor long spring. All right, so they're both long spring traps. And then we have, and these are the most commonly used traps sort of internationally really, these are called double coil traps. So they don't have a long spring, they're run by coils that operate those levers. Mm-hmm. And the traps are categorised in terms of their size by numbers. So this is a Victor number 1, which is basically the smallest trap that you can get, but it's the most commonly used trap, leg hole trap that's used for possums in New Zealand now.
And that's something that people here at the show could go to a hardware store or a rural
there's some hardware stores might sell them, but there are agents that you can find through the web. And even if you go to the Landcare Research website and search on trap, you'll find some information there. Woodcraft Industries and Mount Maunganui they're the Victor agents, but there are other agents that sell them. And there is other models there's a Duke trap, BMI trap, Sleepy Creek trap, so they're all different makes of the same model.
Right.
Yeah. So that's a number 1, and then the next size up is a 1.5, and then there's bigger ones as well that they use overseas for capturing beaver and coyotes and wolves and that sort of thing. But typically in New Zealand, the two models that you see are the number 1 and the number 1.5. Now, because of that welfare concerns, the Americans were getting the same pressure as the New Zealanders were about the inhumaneness or the perceived inhumaneness of these traps. So they developed the number 1 soft catch trap and the number 1.5 soft catch trap. And these have polymer jaws. They have slightly weaker springs, but not too much weaker. And they have a central pivot so the trap can pivot when the animal's captured. So I'll set this and you can have a look at the jaws.
So it's quite easy to set.
Yeah, they're not hard to set. Well, again, I mean, if I gave it to you, you'd be all fingers and thumbs probably. But so there you can see the padded jaw there. That's meant to be specially formulated because a lot of the American trapping, they do it below 0 temperatures, so they're working in freezing conditions all the time. And then I can put my hand in there, and it stings a wee bit, but there's no way that you'd get me to put my hand in there.
Now, that raises an interesting point, because these are hold traps.
Yes.
So then the person who's got the trap has then got to deal with euthanizing the animal. Yep. So if someone buys one of these traps, do they have to be confident in actually dispatching the animal, and if they're not, what do they do?
What do they do? Well, again, there's no point in getting to more humane traps or welfare-friendly traps if then you're cruel to the animal when you're trying to euthanize it. So if you're not competent at killing an animal quickly in a leg hold trap, don't use a leg hold trap. Go to a kill trap, and I'll show you those later on. Or find someone who's competent and confident enough to do it for you. But I'll go back. I mean, one of the issues that when these traps came out, people said, well, we've got a more humane version, why can't we get rid of all these? Unfortunately, these traps allow a lot of the captured animals to escape, so you can get 20 to 25% of your animals escaping, and that's why they haven't really sort of taken over the unpadded traps. And I also mentioned that the gin trap is prohibited now.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of people thought it had been prohibited, several years ago, but as of January 2009, this is no longer allowed to be used, or any similar trap. In January 2011, the 1.5 model is not allowed to be used, so there's a sort of 2-year phase-out period of this larger trap. So really, the only traps that will be allowed, leg hold traps that will be allowed to be used in New Zealand, is the number 1 in either the Victor or the other models, the Dukes and whatever, or the padded traps, the 1.5 or the number 1 padded trap.
Okay.
But the number 1 will be the only unpadded trap. But it could be a double coil, or it could be a long spring. That's a number 1 long spring. All right?
Yep.
So if you... Oh, and the other thing that will restrict people, what people might be able to use, is leg hold traps are not allowed to be used within 150 metres of a dwelling without the express permission of that dwelling owner, or if there's no pets around. So, you don't want to catch pets. So there is a regulation saying that leg hold traps are not allowed to be set within 150 metres of a dwelling.
Yes.
Now, kill traps, probably the most commonly, this has got orange juice all over it. This is the Tim's trap. I think it's named after Tim, who developed it, and he based his principle, the killing trap principle, looking at one of the old toasters that had those floppy sides that you pulled down, and then if you gave them a bit of a flick, they flicked back up. And that's the whole principle of the killing bar in this trap. And this is really probably the second kill trap that was designed in New Zealand specifically for possums. So the first was the Banya that I showed you before, that was a utter failure. This one's been around for about probably 15 to 20 years, and it's probably got the market share. A huge number of these traps have been sold.
And how much would you pay for one?
Most of the kill traps are around $25, $30. You can buy these from most stock and station agents. Very easy to set. You just pull the string, and that lowers the killing bar.
Yes.
And then you bait the trigger hook.
What sort of bait?
Piece of apple or carrot, or you could tie a bit of felt on there and put peanut butter on it or something like that. And then the animal pulls the trigger forward, if I can let it off, and it goes off. Now, when people hear that, they think, oh, it's got lots of power, it'll break the possum's neck and the animal will die quickly. There's actually very little power in there. It's just that the bars come from there all the way up to there and hit the top, and it goes bang. But an animal's here, and the bar only travels from there to there before it hits the animal, and then it pushes it up into here. And this trap, in terms of meeting the NAWAC guidelines, is just marginal. And in fact, I've had 3 possums pull out of these traps. But within 3/4 of an hour, they've come back and put their head back in a second time, and they got killed the second time. So they didn't learn from their first exposure to these traps. But they are Australian animals. So, yeah.
And do they die from asphyxia?
If they're aligned with the top of the head there and the bottom here, and the bar occludes the two carotid arteries, so it stops oxygen going to the brain, they'll die quite quickly, within about 40 or 50 seconds from anoxia. If they turn side on, so you've got to be careful how you put the bait on so they don't turn their head. If they turn their head and they get caught laterally, then they can survive for quite a long time, and that's when sometimes they'll escape, or people will see lots of scratch marks all around here because the animal's been struggling. So for this trap, it's really critical that you have your bait horizontal, so the animal will bite it that way and not want to turn and bite it that way.
So it pays to have a bit of skill to use this, or to learn how to use it properly.
And I mean, you want to put a bait here and a bit of bait on the ground just to entice the animal in. But I mean, this is the easiest trap for the backyard person, for a garden or a lifestyle block. And you can use it as you can buy rabbit pellets or whatever and pre-feed, or bits of apple, and just pre-feed it initially, get the animals, comfortable, interested and comfortable, put their head in there, and then bait the trigger, and you'll get them that way. Got to be careful. Cats, this has also passed the standard NAWAC guidelines for feral cats. So if you've got feral cats and you're concerned about your wildlife, you can use this trap.
Now,
but again, and you bait it with meat and that sort of thing. If you're trying to keep your pets out of it, you're best to set these for 1 or 2 hours after dark, keep your pets inside. Or, as I did, set it off before and it goes bang, do that in front of your cat and scare it. But the safest way is keep your cat away from them. Yeah.
Now, probably a good time to explain to a lot of people who won't know what feral means.
Feral, okay. I just use the term feral for cat because if I start talking about killing cats, people might, particularly cat lovers, might get concerned that I'm talking about their pet cat. So feral just means wild. So wild cats, yeah. And feral's usually a domestic animal that's gone wild. So we have feral pigs in New Zealand as well. Yeah. All right.
Right.
So if we look at, you take that one. Now this is a totally different mechanism, and this is another very easy trap to use for the backyard person. Put a piece.
Possums again?
Yeah, for possums. Yeah, although most of these traps are sold for multiple species. So this one's marketed for possums and ferrets, and you can get a little attachment on here to make the diameter smaller for ferrets. But it hasn't passed. Most of the traps have not passed the NAWAC testing standard for ferrets. Ferrets are actually really difficult to kill, and there's only been one trap, I'll show you later on, that's passed for the ferrets. Yeah. But this is a noose trap, so you set that by pulling that forward, and I can pull that down there, and that's your noose, and you set that there, and again they go in there to grab the apple, and then that goes up, and they get caught in there. So it's a noose trap. And you just sit that on the side of your tree, yes. and they go up into that, and you find them hanging there.
Pretty simple.
Yeah, very simple. Yeah.
Is that New Zealand made?
Yeah, it's and again you can find that it's called a Possum Master, and again if you go to the Landcare website, but if you just did a search on Possum Master, you'll find the site that's you can get them from. Yeah. All right, so you want to grab that one. And then we get into, I haven't brought all my traps, but this is designed by a chap in Taranaki, and it's made by a trailer coupling firm, which you can see the engineering. So it's called a carrot trap, and again it's a kill trap, and quite a lethal looking one. So this killing bar comes right up here, and then again the animal puts his head in there, and it's caught, when that comes down. Yeah.
And how's that held
very heavy
onto the ground?
And again, it's attached to a tree like that. Yeah. So most of these are vertical sets. Yeah. Yep. So that's called a carrot trap.
That's quite a solid.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Very. Yeah. Yeah. You wouldn't want to carry too many in a pack. Yeah. This is called the Warrior Trap, and it's marketed by Conservation in Auckland. And again, if you go to the Landcare website, you can find out about it. And it's got. Again, I won't set it, but the cover of the trap is actually the spring, so it's got no additional springs. So the cover of the trap is actually spring steel. So the whole thing's driven by that spring steel plate. And again, that sits horizontally too.
Right.
Yeah.
A popular one?
Yeah, quite popular. I mean, the most popular one is this one here. This is called a century. It's actually a sort of a copy of an LD101, which was developed in Canada for marten, and I tested that as part of an ISO process when we were developing the standards. And then, someone with a few clues in New Zealand, adapted it and changed it a wee bit and got it working really well for possums, and that's become a very popular trap. It's also got a attachable bait holder here. I can take that off. Get it off. And you put peanut butter. Peanut butter is a really good bait for possums and rats and ferrets. Most animals, for some reason, like peanut butter. But often when you're trapping possums, you get rats taking the bait. So this bait holder allows you to put peanut butter into the grooves and the rats can't get in it. So there's always a bit of bait in there. So that comes with that holder.
And how does this attach to a tree?
Well, you actually nail a little piece of stick, like a piece of broom handle, and then you put that, so that sits like that again, and you set it by lifting that up. So again, the animal's caught in there.
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
But this one, unlike this one, this is the cover of the trap. So this has got it built-in cover. This one needs a cover like this to go over it. So you have it sitting up on a tree, up in there, and that stops the animal getting in from the side or the top or whatever. Yeah.
And again, roughly.
They're all around about $30, $25 to $35, $38.
And they can be used for years.
And they can be used for years. Yeah, most of them are pretty robust. Yeah. I mean, a lot of these new traps have been developed because of the concern about the animal welfare issues with leg hold traps. And also, when the animal welfare legislation was changed in 1999, it allowed kill traps to be left indefinitely between checks. Up until then, all traps had to be checked every day. So if you're trapping in an area where there's not that many possums, but you're trying to maintain them at low density, you've got to go back every day, and that's a big cost. But kill traps, you can set and check them once a week or whatever. So because of that cost effectiveness advantage, with that change in legislation, a lot of people started designing kill traps. So quite a few have come on the market just in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. Yeah. Now I'll just show you this one. This is called a set and forget, and there's another trap very similar called a hold and multi-kill trap, and it's just like a big rat trap really. So this bar comes up and sits up here, and again that has to get set in a cubby. So again up on a tree or on the ground, but mainly up on a tree. Very, very powerful trap, but none of these have passed for ferrets. They're sold as ferret traps that they can, and they will catch and they will kill ferrets. But in terms of how quickly they kill ferrets, they don't kill them quickly enough for the NAWAC standards. And I should have said, to pass that test, a kill trap has to kill 10, so if it was ferrets you were testing, it has to render 10 animals out of 10, so you might have a sample size of 10. All of those 10 animals have to be rendered unconscious and then die within 3 minutes. And some people say, well, 3 minutes is a very long time. But to actually meet that, they've got to be rendered unconscious quicker than that. But that's the standard we use. Most of these traps have failed to do that. But the legislation at this stage doesn't prohibit anything at the moment. So even though some of these traps have been tested and haven't passed, they can still be sold for those particular species. And that's because the legislation doesn't approve traps, it only prohibits them. And the prohibition process takes a few years to do because you've got to go out to public consultation, so there's quite a process involved. So although we know these particular traps shouldn't be used for a particular species, they haven't been prohibited yet.
So how can the consumer find out which trap is best and which one would suit their needs and would do the best, most effective job? 2
ways. Again, if they go to the Landcare Research website and search on trap performance or trap testing or traps, there is a page there or several pages that will tell them which traps have been tested and which ones have passed that test. They're not approved traps, they've just been tested and passed. The other option is to go to the NPCA website, and the NPCA is the National Possum Control Agency, so a small group in Wellington. They have a whole lot of publications, and one of them is about like a consumer guides to trapping. So you could get that, and that's free download as well, and that'll tell you all about the different traps and what's recommended for different use in different areas and for different species. Yeah. So there's some really good information sources out there. Yeah. Yep.
Now there's equal diversity with it for other animals.
Yeah. And so forth? Just before I go on to that, these set of traps. So they're all called These are Connie Bear or Connie Bear type trap. Frank Connie Bear developed these kill traps in the 1920s, again in America and in response, or in Canada, in response to the welfare concerns about leg hole traps. Yes. And they come out and they're sort of a scissor type trap. So you set them like that and the animal goes in here and gets caught like that, which I can't get my hand out of. Can you see if you can undo that one?
Push it down?
Yeah, yep. That's right, thank you. So that one's a 220, right? Hey? No, it's not too bad. No. This is a little 110, so they all come, like the Victor, the leg hole traps, they all come in different sizes, and that's a 160. So you tailor the size to the species you're after. But just like you saw, they're actually quite tricky to use. They're the main trap that's used in North America. All their trappers use these traps. But in New Zealand, they just really haven't taken off because people haven't built up the skills to use them, including myself.
How's that?
All right? Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, this is actually another restraining trap or a leg hole trap developed by a veterinarian in America for catching raccoon. And it's called an egg trap. And raccoons are a bit like possums, that they like manipulating their food, so they'll pick a marshmallow up or a pellet or a bit of food and they'll sit and they'll eat it with their paws, and they pick with their forepaws. So what they do, they bake this in here with a marshmallow, and the raccoon puts its paw in there, and there's a little capture bar that holds the paw in there. But because this is all smooth, they don't get any injury, and because the foot is actually encased, they can't bite their foot either. And raccoons were notorious for chewing on their foot below the jaw. So if you just use a standard leg hole trap, raccoons used to damage their claws, what people didn't like. Now, possums don't do that. Most other animals don't do that, but raccoons did. So this was one attempt by a veterinarian to come up with a humane trap for raccoons. So there's just all sorts of sort of machines out there that have been developed. It's amazing. Yeah. Now if we go on to the mustelids, so the mustelids are the stoat, ferret and weasel. And in New Zealand, the main kill trap that's been used for stoats for several decades now is this trap, and it's called the fen trap. And it comes in two sizes, the Mark IV and the Mark VI. And DOC, the Department of Conservation, have used these traps for many, many years to do effective control of stoats over quite large areas. But our trap testing, when we had the NAWAC guidelines available and we started testing these traps, they didn't perform very well at all. In fact, they performed very, very poorly. Some stoats are still alive the next day. They weren't even being killed, even though it was a kill trap, and approved in England for use on those species. So because of that, DOC invented a new series of traps, and they should be really commended for that. And I'll show you one of these. So this is the trap that they developed, Darren Peters,
solid looking,
and a chap Waddington, developed this series of traps. And they come in three sizes, the 150, 200 and 250. This is a DOC 200. And again, if you go to the website, if you just do a search on predator traps, you'll end up with a site that's solely focused on this trap. But again, you can find it through the Landcare research website as well.
And let's be clear, this is for stoats.
It was developed for that, but it's passed for stoats, it's passed for hedgehogs, it's passed for rats, And the bigger model, the 250, is the only trap that's passed for ferrets. Right? It's got to be set in a cubby, in a tunnel, and you pull that, the bar comes right up there, so the animal gets struck by one of these 6 or multiple bars. Very, very effective trap, and a stoat would be almost killed instantly. So in terms of that 3-minute time frame, I mean, there's just been a huge advance in welfare going from the fen trap to this trap. And DOC is slowly replacing, or not slowly, rapidly replacing all their fen traps and replacing them with these DOC traps.
That would be a big job, though.
A big job and a big expense, but you know.
So they should be commended for it.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, yep. And internationally, there's increasing interest in this trap too. Yeah. And again, it's just set in a cubby, so they normally bait it with an egg or a bit of meat. So you can see those three nails there. You can set an egg into there, and then the trap sits in there, like that. And then you close it off, and there's a hole in the grid there for a stoat to go through, and then another hole in the grid further in. So there's actually two grids, one grid there and one grid there. So the stoat has to go in there, around there, through there, and across the plate, and that's to stop kiwi and other ground birds, weka, getting access to the trap, so you don't kill those species.
And that difficulty is not going to put an animal off?
No, stoats, no problem at all.
Free egg, they'll go for it.
Yep. And DOC, in fact, have used these now for eradicating stoats off Secretary Island, and they've attempted to on Resolution Island, but may or may not have been successful, but yeah. No, very, very successful.
Is this something that the public can buy?
Yes. Again, if you go to that predator trap or predator web page, you'll find out where to get them. You get them from. I mean, they're made by Curtis Springs in Auckland, and Haynes, I think, make the box, so you can buy the box. But all up, it's about $60, so it's not cheap. So if you've got stoats and you want to do a cheap model, one option is to use a Victor snapback trap. So this is just a rat trap. You don't want that trigger on it, you just want a small normal trigger that you can put a wee bit of meat on it. And then you just want to make something like that out of a plastic milk bottle. So it's just so you can bend it. And then that goes sort of through there and like that. And that makes sure the stoat or the rat, even for rats it's good to do this, it makes sure the stoat always approaches from the front, not from the side, and that always strikes it across the cranium. And again, these will kill instantaneous. All right. They haven't passed on our tests because we had to get 10 out of 10 and we only got 9 out of 10 because one escaped. But in terms of a cheap version, if you didn't want to spend $60 or $70 on that, that's a good way to go for stoats. And it can be just set like that above the ground. You can put a bit of meat here, then a bit of meat in the trap, and you've got a very cheap stoat trap.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. And as I said, there's those other traps that get sold for ferrets and stoats, but they haven't passed the trial. Another one is the tunnel trap that was sold for ferrets, and again, so an animal goes through that, and there's a killing bar that comes up and catches the animal. I mean, that's an appalling trap in terms of animal welfare. Doesn't kill the animals at all. So a lot of these traps can get sold, but because more and more people are being aware that there has been this testing going on, less and less of these types of traps are being sold and being used, which is a good thing. Yeah. So you want to? I'll throw that over here. So that's probably all I want to say about stoats and rats. So we can go on to rodents if you want. The smallest beast. So we can go back to this one. Okay. This is as good as you'll get, really, if you're just trying to catch rats. There is a new one came out recently called the Nooski trap, and you can buy these in Bunnings or some of the hardware shop. And it actually operates with a rubber ring, like a docking ring. So you want to stick your finger in. So this one's loaded. It's got the rubber ring set here, and that's set in there, and you put some bait in here, inside here, and then the animal comes along and and pushes that trigger up, so it comes in here, through here, pushes that, and you got it. And that actually passed as well. So it kills them, renders them unconscious.
Rats.
No,
Just
rats. We just test on rats. Yeah. Yep. So that's now again, we don't test capture efficiency. We only test, given the animal got captured, was it killed quickly? All right. This one you probably catch more rats than you will in this, but those sort of tests really haven't been done. All right.
Got a few.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. And there's a variety of other and there's all sorts of rat traps around. There's plastic ones, these are called snappy traps, and they're actually really good traps. But they're a wee bit dearer than the wooden ones, so if you've only got one or two rats to catch, it's probably just best to buy the cheapest ones.
Yes.
And most hardware shops have those. And then there's mouse traps come in all sorts of sizes. You can get live capture ones. This is a live, so if you don't want to kill your animals but you just want to liberate them and the neighbours, you can catch these, and the mouse goes in there and then tips it and the door closes. So you've got a live mouse, and you go, what am I going to do with it? And the same with that one. That's a live capture one. So they go in there and run up onto here to the bait, and they get caught in there. Right?
Can they get back out?
No. Well, they can because they haven't got the end on it, but
right.
not normally.
Right.
No. Then you have this. There's a live capture trap, so you wind it up, and then you put a bait in through here, and the animal goes in here, and when it triggers it, it unwinds, and again you've got a live mouse in here. What do you do with it? So it's actually better to use a kill trap and kill them quickly and humanely. So there's a whole range of kill traps. The standard little Victor, so that's like the rat one, but it's just the mouse one. And the snappy is the rat one and the mouse one. But because rodents are seen, probably recognised internationally as pests, nobody really cares about them. And so they might care about how a possum's killed or a rabbit's killed, but when it comes to rodents, they think, it doesn't really matter. But it does. I mean, a rodent is as sentient as you and I, really. But there's been no testing of these traps. And the only testing I'm aware of is my daughter did a science fair project a few years ago, and she tested a range of these mouse traps, and the one that came out the best, caught the most, and caught them mostly in the place where they'd die quickly, was this little snappy trap. So if I recommended anyone, I'd recommend that. But any of them work okay. I mean, some of them are very easy to set. And then
that's not very strong.
No, it's not. No, but that doesn't matter to a lot of people as long as it catches them. It does kill them though. Yeah, yep. How quickly it kills them, we don't know because they haven't been tested. And then there's multiple capture traps. So this one can be set to capture 4 mice. Yeah. So
you made an interesting point a couple of days ago that humans live very closely with rodents.
Yeah. I mean, there's a saying that in town, in here, you're never further than 5 metres from a rat. I mean, they're down in the sewers. If you go to the strip in Christchurch, where everyone goes for a drink, if you just walk over to the Avon there in the evening and just wait and look, there's rats there. I mean, there's never rats far from people. And those commensal rodents are the ones that sort of live with us and comfortable living with us. And sometimes people see them and that's when they want to buy traps. Yeah. And the last sort of mouse trap I've got is this one here. This is made in Sweden, so it's not made by Volvo, but it is a very good trap. And again, you put the bait in here and the mouse goes in here and lifts that a wee bit, and then bang, it gets caught there. So, which one's best, it doesn't really matter, it's buyer beware. But it's good to get people to think about welfare, even though they're rodents or there's other pests around. You should try and kill them as quickly as you can. And with the technologies around, we're getting better and better at doing it, and people should be responsible enough to do that. Yeah. And if you're not comfortable with doing it, then get someone who is that can do it for you. And I haven't spoken about toxins. I mean, there's toxins available too, but if you don't like putting toxins around, and a lot of the toxins that you buy Mitre 10 are anticoagulants, and they're actually quite persistent in the environment. So if you want to be clean and green, you're better off using a non-toxic system for controlling your pests.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, fascinating.
All right. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's
right.
really excellent.
Yeah, pleasure. It's good.